Welcome back to the #1 breakfast show in the country, Morning at NTV, ahead of World Wildlife Day tomorrow, March 3rd. I do have Mr. Tom Okello, the Executive Director for the National Forestry Authority, to compound more on the issue of saving our forests, nature, and also, yes, wildlife in that regard. Why are so many people actually living close or within reserves? You have 250 to 300 million people living within our forests or natural reserves. That is a recipe for disaster that can be precipitated by cutting down of trees, which can lead to desertification and so forth. So we do have the ED, National Forestry Authority, Tom Okello. He shall be joined later on by Mr. Akankwasa, Dr. Akankwasa Badirega. He's the Commissioner of Wildlife in the Ministry of Tourism. Very good morning, Mr. Tom Okello.
Good morning, and good morning, viewers and listeners.
So tomorrow, that is March 3rd, we shall be commemorating World Wildlife Day. So in simple terms, for the viewer who is watching right now, what is World Wildlife Day?
Yeah, World Wildlife Day is a day which was gazetted and commissioned by the United Nations
General Assembly.
General Assembly. I think that was, I'm not remembering the year very well, but just to make the wildlife
I think
relevant.
the signatory was in 2013,
yeah,
and then ratified in 1973.
Yeah, so it was just to make people aware of the plight of wildlife and the importance of wildlife. In fact, it is one of the globally recognized days because of what wildlife is going through. Because if you remember, just like in Uganda here, by beginning of 1900, if I may make it in relation to forest, the Uganda forest cover at 1900 was over 50% of the land area of Uganda. The population, the human population was very low. At that time, wildlife in Uganda was free-ranging. Free-ranging. There were elephants in Luero. In fact, there could have been elephants in Kampala. Some people say the name Kampala comes from Impala.
Yes.
So the whole place was covered with wildlife. Now, with the increasing population, habitat kept on being squeezed, and then the animals were being pushed away. Now, by 1960s, by 1950s, no, let me say around 1940s, the government, at that time, this was the colonial government, gazetted the first law, the Game Control Act, which was to protect the Ugandans from wildlife. You see, that time wildlife was more than the people. But now, what is happening?
The danger was from wildlife.
Was from wildlife. Yes. But now we have laws protecting wildlife from people.
Because they've been dwindling because of the encroachment on natural reserves.
On the habitat. Yes. So that one brings you to forest. In 1900,
yes,
53% of Uganda was forested.
1990,
yeah, it came to 24%.
I see.
That was half was gone almost. Now we are talking of about 12.4%. Yeah, 12.4% forest cover for the country. Now, it really shows you that if we remove all the habitat, then where will the wildlife be? Because like in Kampala here, by 20 years ago, there was a lot of forest in this area and a lot of wetlands. Now, during the 20 years, there is a lot of calls being given to the Wildlife Authority, to some of us who are in conservation, come and pick your animal, come and pick your python. A python has been displaced and has sent at somebody's chicken house. So, that is now, it brings us to the question of what is the relevance of this day? The relevance is that it is bringing out the plight of wildlife. It is talking about how do we coexist, because we must live. Wildlife must be there, even human beings must be there. You know, in the Bible, God created all these things and said, man, you're going to take charge of these things here. But only that man became so aggressive and almost failed to use it sustainably. So this is also to give the plight of wildlife and to talk about sustainable utilization. Yes, it is supposed to be there for human survival. But how do we use it sustainably?
Yeah. Mr. Tom Okello, on the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, around March, the tail end of March, we saw so many people resort to different measures to actually make a living. Many resorted to charcoal burning, others, so many other activities. And then we saw so much encroachment on these natural habitats during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you think this has persisted up to now? What is the magnitude of this problem?
No, the problem has subsided. True, at the onset of COVID, you know, there was lockdown. And during the lockdown, all activities came to a standstill. The sources of livelihoods disappeared. Now, many people resort to what they perceive as free goods. You know, people look at forest, look at the wetlands. These are common goods. These are goods which is for public goods, which is for the benefit of everybody and even the global community. So many people resorted to forest to burn charcoal, thinking it is a free good. So we saw a lot of influx of people entering forest because they had lost their alternative livelihoods. And we really had to run around, do a lot of patrols, a lot of sensitizations, some arrests, and eventually the situation came to normal, near normal. Not normal, but near normal. So that is what happened. And, you know, the theme for this year's World Wildlife Day celebration is really good. We are talking of forest and livelihoods. You see, it has recognized that thing called forest. Really, you mentioned it at the beginning.
Indeed.
That about 200 million,
250 to 300 million.
Million people living, indigenous people, local people living around the forest, depend entirely on this forest. In Uganda, so many people, in fact, Uganda, the statistics is that between 20 to 25% of people in the developing countries derive their livelihoods from nature. So
that was even the case before the white man came to
before the white man,
Africa.
Before the white man, possibly we are deriving almost more than 50%.
100%, yes.
Yeah, from nature.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So what are some of the disadvantages of this encroachment on our natural habitats?
So the encroachment, first of all, you are losing the habitat. You are aware that our forest cover, our wildlife resources dwindle for a very long time. Indeed. It is now that things have started having a positive trend. So you are losing habitat. When you lose habitat, you are losing the food, you are losing the cover, and then eventually the wildlife themselves get lost.
You're also actually putting the public in a position of danger for other coronaviruses to leave animals and into human beings.
You are increasing contact. You are increasing contact between wildlife and human beings.
That's a very good
Because you
point.
see, when you remove habitat, you have heard about the chimpanzee problems in Bunyoro,
yes,
where chimpanzees are attacking children. Just as we talk now, yesterday I was seeing in social media, there's a child that has broken a leg running away from chimpanzee. So we are bringing them nearer to the people. So in that way, there is also possibility of these
coronaviruses jumping from the animals to the humans.
Yeah, what they call the zoonotic diseases, the disease which is transmitted from wildlife.
And we hear there are almost 100 coronaviruses residing within animals. They haven't jumped from one animal to a human. So we need to be careful.
Yeah, that is true.
Another danger.
Another danger is that we are losing biodiversity. So you have heard about species erosion, where we have lost certain species are extinct. You heard about the white rhino in Uganda, which is extinct.
The pangolin.
The pangolin is still there, but it is threatened. You have heard about the gorillas being endangered, the chimpanzees, those are all endangered species. Elephants, endangered species, the lions. So the population is reducing. So if we don't protect them, then possibly the future generation, you know, we talked about sustainable utilization or sustainable management, where we are looking at a resource meeting the needs of the future generation. So when we take them, we are not mining of tomorrow. And we use these resources for development. For example, we use the forest resources. We get timber, we get poles. Now, if you remove all of them, what happens?
Go ahead.
So if you remove them, then we are not going to get the required resources for our own development. So these are some of the dangers of finishing what we have. And
of course, there is also the other issue, Mr. Tom Okello, of desertification.
I was coming there.
An issue of climate change. If you cut down all the trees, how will we be able to combat desertification? We have farmers who are now talking about dry spells.
That is what I was coming
changes in the harvest period, the changes in the planting season, they've all been twisted because of climate change. So talk to us about the dangers of cutting down trees and desertification.
So you see, the trees play a very important role, first of all in the water cycle, and then 2 in nutrients recycling, 3 in protection of soil from erosion and stopping runoff. So when you clear all this cover, you are exposing your soil to erosion. The nutrient recycling is interfered with, the water cycle is interfered with, the wind speed increases, Tomorrow, there's no rain. Now, when there's no rain, what do you expect? The food security is interfered with. And then you find there is the issue of temperature increasing at the micro level and even globally. So these are the dangers which we are seeing. And already people are feeling the pinch. The weather, the climate has become unpredictable. Last year, we are talking of floods. Who knows? It may come back this year.
Indeed. Mr. Tom Okello, the Executive Director, National Forestry Authority, is not alone. We've been joined by the Commissioner of Wildlife Conservation at the Ministry of Tourism, that is Dr. Akankwasa Badirega. He has made it to the studio. Very good morning, sir.
Very good morning
to
you and our viewers.
Indeed. We'll start right away with you to give us a situation analysis on wildlife conservation at the Ministry of Tourism. What is the situation analysis?
Thank you very much, and good morning again, our viewers.
Indeed.
The situation is that, one, we are coming from a very, very bad situation that has been characterized by civil strife, 1970s, 1980s. But we are looking at a situation of slow and steady recovery of some populations of wildlife. Elephants, for example, have recovered from poultry 1,900 in 1984 to now 6,000 plus. Some species like the Uganda cobs, they've been fully recovered beyond the populations of the post-independence Uganda. So yes, it's a mixed feeling. Some species have recovered fully, others are steadily recovering. Others are declining, for example, the lions, some bird species like our beloved crested crane. So those species are declining largely on account of habitat loss. The wetlands are under attack. The forests are under attack, as my colleague has already told you. So it's a mixed situation, successes and failures. So what's important is that we must realize that we cannot race against nature.
Indeed.
We cannot.
Dr. Akankwasa Badirega would also like to know why conserve wildlife. The viewer who is watching right now would like to know.
Well, conservation of wildlife, I equate it to conservation of human life. So to conserve wildlife, you are really conserving yourself. One, we get literally everything from nature, right from agriculture that we pride in. You cannot have your crops pollinated without bees. Bees, that's wildlife. We cannot get jobs, the much needed jobs, foreign exchange and incomes without wildlife. You must know that tourism, based largely on wildlife, is Uganda's leading foreign exchange earner, generating 1.5 billion Uganda shillings annually, and employing 8% of Ugandans. And right now, as I speak, if you look at the situation of unemployment in Uganda, we really need jobs, and nature provides these jobs. But without going economics, we derive medicine from wildlife. We derive food from wildlife. So literally, wildlife sustains every bit of our livelihoods that we enjoy.
Indeed, but then we'd also like to know some of the successes and the challenges you've encountered while conserving wildlife. Break down some of those, starting with the challenges.
Well, the challenges, we continue to grapple with the challenges of habitat loss. The forest cover, especially outside the protected areas, is being lost at a very high rate. And this leaves wildlife species without habitats. And of course, that increases human-wildlife conflict. If chimps' habitat have been cut down, definitely you will encounter them. If snakes do not have where to go.
What Tom Okello was talking about, chimps attacking actually young people within.
They have nowhere to go.
Areas, yes.
Their habitats have been decimated. You've seen snakes roaming around even in Kampala here, including monkeys in the city here. That tells you that their houses, or what they call home, has been decimated. We still have challenges of poaching, illegal wildlife trade and trafficking. We have challenges of climate change. We still have challenges of underfunding, I must say. World over, perhaps maybe largely Africa, conservation is not seen as very critical for the economy. So there is there is a tendency to think that, you know, conservation, yes, is important, but not very critical. But I can tell you, you cannot sustain any economic investment minus conservation.
Has poverty played a role in this scourge of encroachment on our
very
wildlife?
significant one. A very significant
How
one.
so?
We have crimes of need and crimes of greed. Now, you can't tell a hungry man to conserve. They do not know what is tomorrow. They want today's meal on the table. So poverty is actually the biggest driver of conservation challenges, because a hungry man will go to poach. A hungry man will have no alternative sources of livelihood, so he will cut down the forest to get poles for construction. So a hungry man will not appreciate the importance of conservation. You will not tell a hungry man that you see rainfall formation is influenced by forests. No, a hungry man will want food on the table. To sustain future generation, you must sustain current generation. So you cannot have current generation minus addressing the issue of poverty. But what is ironical is that when you deplete nature, you are actually increasing poverty, because nature sustains actually all the programs that alleviate
Because
poverty.
if you cut down trees, it leads to desertification and it affects farmers who are in agriculture, leading to more poverty. Go
Absolutely.
ahead, Badirega.
Yes. Now, the other challenges, we have competing land uses. You find there is high demand for industrialization, which is a good thing. High demand for electrification, for example, which is also a good thing. But what is important, how can we strike a balance over the two? How can we have the industries minus destroying the wetlands? How can we have the industries minus eliminating forests?
How can we have the
sugar?
balance? Yes.
How can we have sugarcane growing minus destroying tropical rainforests? So to me, we can have both. What's important is to have proper land use for the country, to understand that this land will best provide value to Ugandans through being a forest. This land will provide the best value through being sugarcane plantation. So we must zone our land and use each part of the land to what it does best. Yeah.
What about relocation of individuals from these natural habitats?
Relocation of individuals, yes, that's also important, but to me the bigger picture should be control of our population.
All right, I would like to also talk about the successes and gains of forestry or natural habitat conversation, but you were also about to tell us about the successes that you've actually encountered during this journey.
Well, there is a lot of success. My brother Tom must have already told you that the bad situation of 1990 to 2017 is now being reversed. There is recovery of forest cover.
No, wildlife. You're talking about wildlife.
Yeah, you see, people
You
confuse.
talk about forests.
People confuse wildlife. They
Yes.
don't know that wildlife includes forests. Wildlife is plants and animals, wild plants and animals.
But I wanted you to focus
So,
on wildlife so that Tom
You
can
want
focus
me
on the
to focus
forest.
on wild animals because wildlife includes the forest.
Includes the
But
plant.
if you want me to focus
Good
on
one.
wild animals, not wildlife,
Yes.
because when you say wildlife, it includes the
Even the
forest.
habitat itself.
Aha. So, but I can focus on wild animals.
So poaching has reduced.
Poaching has been curbed, I must say. You must have seen that we now have dogs at most of our points of exit and entry. You will no longer have the luxury of exiting Entebbe Airport with ivory, because you will find sniffer dogs, which will not allow you to carry our ivory. So we've enhanced our capacity in terms of skills, in terms of equipment, in terms of numbers. So we are able now to, in real time, detect ivory trafficking across our border posts.
All right.
We have a more coordinated, robust network of all government law enforcement agencies, ranging from UPDF, the intelligence services, the Ranger Force under Uganda Wildlife Authority, NFA, NEMA. We now have a national wildlife crime task force,
Amazing.
which is the first of its kind. We have a dedicated court for wildlife offenders, the first in Africa, by the way.
Indeed.
A dedicated wildlife court. So we really want to salute the judiciary for coming to our rescue and seeing that we need to fast track and expedite prosecution of wildlife offenders so that justice is dispensed. Of course, tourism has been growing, as you know. Around 1986, I was looking at figures. we are getting just 540,000 guests. We are now in 1.5 million. That's a huge jump from just 800,000 to 1.5 million. That's a big leap.
That's the enforcement right there in the wee hours of the night. Great work being done. Let me also bring in Mr. Tom Okello. He is the Executive Director, National Forestry Authority. Mr. Okello, let's talk about the successes and the gains of wildlife. Not wildlife conservation, but natural habitat conservation. Yes.
Yeah, I think before I answer you, let me add something on what my colleague has talked about. My colleague talked about conflicting land use leading to challenges in wildlife conservation.
Indeed.
I want to give you some statistics. Many people have been asking, where did the forest go? By 1990, the woodland is a forest, was constituting about 3 million hectares in the country. By 1990, that is 30 years ago. Agricultural land at that time was about 8 million hectares. By 2019, agricultural land increased to over 10 million hectares. Meanwhile, the woodland declined or decreased to about 8 million, by 2 million hectares to about 1 million hectares. So when you are asking, where did the forest go? The forest went to agriculture. And that is the conflicting land use he's talking about. We are having urbanization. We are having industrialization. These are all good. That is development. And development can also bring disasters. So how do we balance? So that is the question. I wanted just to add some statistics on what he was saying. So you are talking about the benefits of
natural habitat
conservation. First of all, it is a known fact that many of us in the developing countries, including Uganda, we rely on nature.
Indeed.
If you remove us now, you remove Ugandans from nature, I don't think we can even last 1 week. Our water is coming from there. Our food is coming from there. The temperatures, the good climate is coming from there. In fact, we are relying on nature for our own survival.
Indeed.
So that is the first benefit. It is making us to live.
Indeed.
Without it, we would not be living. But also the benefit of nature brings in those other, when for example, you look at the Uganda National Development Plan 3, we are talking about inclusive growth. We are talking about industrialization. We are talking about urbanization. Most of the industries, we are talking about inclusive employment. So most of the industries which are coming right now in Uganda are nature-based. We are looking at mining industries. For example, like in the forest sector, we have seen over 10 industries coming up in the last 3 to 4 years to utilize the wood. These are the wood-based industries, relying on nature. What are these industries bringing? We are bringing employment. We are bringing economic growth, and we are employing the Ugandans. So that is part of still the benefits of sustainably or conserving nature. The most important thing is that we must do what we call sustainable utilization or sustainable harvest of the natural resources. Because without sustainable harvest and utilization, then we tilt the balance to the negative.
Are we talking about reforestation? When you cut down trees?
Not only, even what we have, we must use it sustainably. Because, by the way, nature can regenerate by itself.
Indeed.
So long as you are utilizing it sustainably. Like, for example, in the forest sector, we can calculate and know the wood demand for the country, the tree growth, for example. Then you balance. Whatever you are removing must not be beyond what the growth in the forest, in the forest which is planted. But you can also plant to replace what you are removing. So those are part of the harvesting itself must be sustainably done. If you, even in the wildlife, that is the wild animal sector, even in the fisheries, if you remove beyond what it is, because fish is supposed to be a renewable resource.
Indeed.
So if you picked all the big ones, all the mothers, you go to the breeding ground, you pick, and eventually you don't have fish. And you saw what happened in Uganda.
Indeed, yes.
So those are some of the benefits. So now when the benefit is there, he has talked about tourism. We are managing our natural resources well. The animal population is increasing. People are coming. By the way, COVID really hit the tourism sector in Uganda. We had reached a point, I think, of no return. By 2019, I think that was Uganda got a lot of travels, visitors coming as tourists. And if we had got that number in 2020, we would be somewhere.
Meaning COVID-19 undid all that good work.
Travel was banned, the whole world, and the whole world was locked up. So
Do you still feel the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on our natural habitats and wildlife?
We see, for example, we need resources to manage these natural resources. And COVID has affected the cash flows, not only for tourism, but for even the other sectors. So we are not getting enough resources to manage these natural resources. And when you don't have enough resources, then those challenges Doctor was talking about, the issues of, you need to patrol, you need to manage, you need to talk to the people, those challenges come up because your mobility, for example, may be affected because of the inadequate resources. So when we manage these resources, well, we are looking at the impacts of climate change to be one of the biggest absorber of the greenhouse gases and the natural vegetation. So if we conserve, we are removing the greenhouse gases, we are mitigating.
Because they use carbon dioxide and give off oxygen, which you need.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the issue of alternative sources of energy. Don't you think with government's slow government's move or slow move to expedite alternative sources of energy like wind energy, solar energy, do you think the pressure on trees to make charcoal shall persist?
No, it is going to persist because, for example, in Uganda, about 90%, over 90%, we are using fuel wood. And this fuel wood is charcoal, about 18%, firewood, about 78%. So you can imagine only about 4% is using that alternative you are talking about. And this trend is most likely going to continue in the short term, in the medium term, and probably in the long term, unless we address the issues of the cost and supply of the alternatives. What are the main feasible alternatives for now? We already have gas in Uganda. We already have electricity in Uganda. Is it affordable? How is the supply, for example?
Gas is around 135 to 150,000 Uganda shillings.
Yes. So, is it affordable?
Very expensive.
Now, in fact, what we should be thinking about is, how do we make gas affordable or cheaper than charcoal? Because charcoal is mainly used in the urban areas. The people in Kampala, in the cities, use charcoal. And charcoal is more destructive than firewood. Because, when you are making charcoal, if you get 100 kilograms of firewood and you burn, the recovery is less than 20%. So you may get only 10 to 15 kilograms of charcoal. So you can see that waste. Now, a bag of charcoal is about 100,000 in Kampala. Gas is about 110, this 12 kilogram cylinder. Is there any way we can make gas 50,000 and make it cheaper than charcoal?
Indeed.
So that these urban people stop using charcoal and then they use gas. And then we stop the charcoal burning, because now when they're not, if there is no market for it, then why are you burning?
But Tom Okello, you and I know very well that we've been having these discussions for over a year. We've had these resolutions on Morning at NTV, paid for interviews from production to just talk about wildlife conservation. And these resolutions always come. Cheap alternative sources of energy. Why is government so slow to implement these? Before I go to Dr. Akankwasa. Go ahead.
No, the government is not slow. I think if you look at the budget strategy for 2019, 2020, then 2020, 2021, the issue of alternative energy was really addressed by Minister of Finance. And I think in so many circles, even the private sector made recommendations to government on the issues of addressing taxation on LPG gas, for example. So, but government also reaches a point like now, we were looking at how do we reduce this gas. Then this pandemic came in. And you see, the energy taxes on energy, it is a tax which you will pay. For example, on fuel, you have to pay. So when government now is faced with cash flow reductions because of COVID, what are the most likely sources of taxes, for example? You now have to probably not remove the taxes from gas this year, because you need this gas, petroleum products. People use it, so you get that money.
Indeed.
So, but somewhere in the cycle, the taxes on LPG was already being considered to be removed if COVID had not come.
Tom Okello, let's give some few minutes to Dr. Kankwasa Badirega before we wrap up on the issue of alternative livelihoods for individuals to stop illegal poaching and encroachment on wildlife.
Yes.
I'm getting word from my studio director that we are going to take a very short break and return with this conversation. But please continue. Please continue.
All right. Yes, alternative sources of livelihood for wildlife. That's a very interesting topic. They are products which can be replicated outside the protected areas and domesticated. They are those which may not be domesticated. So there are things that do not put more pressure on wildlife. For example, beekeeping. So this has been promoted as alternative source of livelihood, not only for money making and incomes, but also to mitigate human-wildlife conflicts. The bees help the elephants not to cross and disturb the people. Craft making, for example, craft and souvenir industry. The local communities are being mobilized to engage in craft making using sustainable access of craft making materials from protected areas. Now, like my brother said, use is not entirely bad. What matters is the sustainability of the use. So we are promoting local communities to engage in arts and crafts, to engage in beekeeping, to engage in sustainable agriculture. Like, for example,
that doesn't harm wildlife.
That doesn't harm wildlife. Like in some forest parks like Bwindi and Chibale, tea farming has been found to be very good as a barrier for wild animals. So not only does it create jobs and generate income for communities, but also it protects the communities from wild animal raids. And then, of course, what is important, like my brother was saying, is to ensure that, in my view, we need to also control the population. The rate of population growth at 3% per annum is one of the highest anywhere in the world. Even if you were developing at a very good rate, all the dividends of development will disappear because the rate of population growth is far higher, and so you will not move. So basically, we encourage people to use or to engage in activities that do not put more pressure on people, including sustainable agriculture, because we know that almost 70 to 80% of our population is engaged in agriculture. So we help them to add value on agriculture. But this time around, we are even talking about agro-tourism. You can make money from your farm, but also bring visitors to earn from your farm. And then targeting the tourism value chain by engaging in activities that supply the chain. For example, vegetables and eggs from local communities.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. Dr. Kankwasa Badirega and Mr. Tom Okello, many thanks for having made the time to speak to both.
You're watching Morning at NTV.
Welcome back. We are continuing with this conversation on conservation. Yes, we do have some between 250 million and 300 million people living within or in natural habitats. So what are some of the ramifications that can be culminated out of that situation? And how can we ensure peaceful coexistence between natural habitats, wildlife, and also the humans and their existence? A very good morning once again, Dr. Kankwasa and Tom Okello. Let me start with you, Tom Okello. Peaceful coexistence between nature and human beings. How can we strike the balance?
I think what we need to do, first of all, we need to create that partnerships. You are talking of between 200 to 300 million people living in or around these natural habitats. Are we involving them in the management of these resources? So I think the most important thing, first of all, is to strike that partnerships between the managers of these natural resources and these communities that you are talking about.
So instead of you policing the communities, the communities can police themselves.
Yes. You have heard about popular saying of collaborative forest management, participatory forest management, where we know we want to draw on what we call the indigenous knowledge.
Indeed.
And then we use it and add that modern science. And then we sustainably manage these resources. So I think that is most important.
Is it feasible though?
It is very feasible. In Uganda here, we are having over 60 collaborative forest management groups. Already we have about over 60,000 hectares of our natural forests, which we are managing in collaboration with these indigenous, with the local communities. So it works. But as everything, there must be good monitoring mechanisms embedded within the agreement. We normally do through a memorandum of understanding. So that is one, building meaningful partnerships with the neighbors, but also with other partners, which I think Doctor will talk about partnerships also. So that is one. Two, we need to look at how do we embed the benefits, because a resource which does not provide benefits will not be protected.
Indeed.
So how do we ensure that these people get benefits? How do we get funding to support the micro forest projects for these people? He talked about apiary, he talked about basketry. Can we do fish farming, for example, within the wetlands which are within these forests, so that these people can get that direct benefit?
So you're talking about how natural habitats can be used to improve the livelihoods of the communities living within the vicinity,
yes,
while they also, as members of the community, conserve the natural habitats.
That
Amazing.
is it. Yeah. Then we must look at the issue of sustainable utilization, sustainable harvesting.
Break it down.
Yes, because these resources, people must use it. You are not going to stop somebody living near a forest reserve from picking firewood. But how do you pick that firewood? Sustainably. Under these agreements which we sign with these people, we allow them to pick dry wood from the forest floor. You don't cut the forest. You don't cut the trees.
It's susceptible to fire,
yes,
forest fire.
So you really need to get that. So how do we ensure sustainable utilization and sustainable harvesting? But we also need better forest protection and enforcement so that these resources is conserved for the future generation. So the most important thing is that we must enhance livelihoods. How do we enhance livelihoods? So this is something which I think the UN this year thought about the theme for the World Wildlife Day celebration and said forests and livelihoods, because it is a known fact that so many people derive livelihoods from forests. But I think the discussion should be, how do we sustain this livelihood?
And in short, they are talking about poverty. So if you give people alternative sources of livelihoods, they won't be putting pressure on their natural habitats.
That is true. So how do we sustain it? So we must address the issue of poverty. Dr. Kankwa's already talked about the issue of population growth, because if we keep on just producing, the land area is static. It is not increasing, unless God does a miracle, probably by increasing, bringing Mars near Earth, and then we get more land. But for now, there is no miracle.
This is all we have.
So we must use what we have sustainably for our own survival. If we don't, then we are perishing ourselves.
All right, Dr. Kankwaza, who are the partners within this initiative, World Wildlife Day, and when will celebrations be held? Given we are in a pandemic, we have some 40,367 cases that have been registered here in Uganda. So how will you be able to execute the celebrations?
Yes, that's a very good question. As you know, previous editions of World Wildlife Day were massive. Last year we had the annual wildlife marathon drawing thousands of people. We in Chisoro, about 40,000 people attendance. We shall not have that kind of glamour this time round because of the circumstances, like you have ably said. So we shall have a scientific event. We have 3 main events, 2 in one and 1 off-site. On the 3rd of March, which is tomorrow, beginning from 9 to midday, gates at Uganda Wildlife Conservation Education Center will be open, free to the public. So everybody who comes to the center from 9 to 12 will enter what we normally call the Ugandan Zoo for free. So I encourage Ugandans to go learn about conservation, to go blend with the nature and learn about wildlife. The main official celebration will be at Sheraton Kampala Hotel, in partnership with UNDP and WWF. This event will be aired live on television. We shall have a discussion, a conversation on conservation relating to the theme, conservation of forests and livelihoods. And then we shall have the annual conservation awards at the same event. This is an invite-only event because of the pandemic. We do not wish to transmit the disease. We would have loved to be with the people who were supposed to be in the east of Uganda. You know, World Wildlife Day is a rotational event. So we were meant to be in the east, and our beloved people of Tororo, of Mbale, of Kapchorwa don't say we did not bring the event to you. We have just paused it. Your turn to host the event has remained there. We shall still plan to come there when the pandemic subsides. So we shall basically be at Sheraton Kampala Hotel from 8 up to 1. We have keynote speakers and panelists, including the one and only my brother. So we shall have a keynote address and then panelists on the theme. We shall have the perspective from the civil society, perspective from the private sector, perspective from the government on how we can actually use forests to sustain livelihoods. So I invite all Ugandans to celebrate World Wildlife Day in your own means. The event will be aired live on television and on social media. So please follow the television and social media to move along the event.
Dr. Kankwansa, the viewer who is watching Morning at NTV right now would like to know, what is the future of wildlife conservation? What kind of, what kind of help do you need from government and members of community with whom you're working?
I can say that the future of wildlife conservation in Uganda is bright. Despite the challenges, these challenges are not insurmountable. These challenges can be surmounted. What we need is the participation of all citizens, because according to our law and tradition, wildlife actually belongs to the people. The government is only a custodian. Unlike other resources, wildlife is owned directly by the citizens. It is different from other resources like the road, like the buildings, which the government can actually dispense. But wildlife conservation, government is only trustee. The owners are the citizens. So what is important is citizenry participation in wildlife conservation. Because like you put it earlier, the citizens are actually the true custodians and guardians and stewards of conservation. Without their appreciation of the need to protect the resource, government alone cannot manage. So we need collaboration with the local communities. We need partnerships by the private sector, partnerships by the civil society and the media, because you people play a very big role in raising awareness about the need to conserve and the benefits
for the acknowledgement, Dr. Kankwansa Badirega. Let's also bring in Tom Okello. We have run out of time, but let's give you some 2 minutes for your parting shots on the future of, now this time around, natural habitat conservation, and what kind of resources or help you need from government and these members of community living or within this vicinity of natural habitats.
So I would say the future of natural habitats in government-owned conservation area is okay, is bright. But the future of national habitat conservation outside this government gazetted area is not good.
What needs to be done? What kind of help do you need?
I think what we need to do is to really do a lot of sensitization of the landowners, because this is land which is owned by you, owned by doctor, owned by me. It is mine. And we are using this land. Possibly we are not aware that even if you own the land, the laws of this land says you must use it in accordance with some laws. If you have your land, you must use it in accordance with the wildlife law, with the forest law, with the environment law. In other words, you must be mindful that yes, it is your land, but also need to recognize that this land is governed by other laws of this country. So the future of forests or natural habitats in private land is not very good. We are seeing a serious change in land use. For example, if I can give you some statistics, by 1990, 70% of the forest cover was outside the government protected areas. That is by 1990. only 30% was in the government protected area. Today, the trend has changed. 60% is in the government protected area and 40% outside the government protected area. So that means about half of what was outside the government protected area is lost.
Indeed.
And the trend is continuing.
Mr. Tom Okello, the Executive Director, National Forestry Authority, and also Dr. Barirega. Yes, Akankwansa is the Commissioner from the Ministry of Tourism. We were also talking about the issue of wildlife conservation, but we also did expound on the issue of zoonotic diseases. They do not want to chase you from these natural habitats, but then there is a threat. Another COVID-19, another coronavirus actually leaving another animal and then jumping to a human being. So we need to be careful as we interact with wildlife, as we interact with natural habitats, to be cognizant of the fact that zoonotic diseases might actually jump from one animal to a human being. There are over 100 coronaviruses, yes, in animals that are yet to jump into humans. At this opportune moment, let me